Hi, this video is for 11th grade English for Wednesday, January 13th. Today we are in our Civil War unit still. We're looking at memory and history. So we've moved into the past Civil War, post-Civil War time, and really thinking about how we remember the Civil War. We're going to look at a text today that's a video, so it's our first Précis option that's not a written text, but a video instead. And your STEM is memory is different from history. So I'm going to move through the slides here on some interested in Civil War monuments and Confederate monuments specifically. So that will guide the discussion today. I'm just giving an example about how to draw these distinctions between memory and history. So here is an obituary for somebody who passed away at the age of 71, lived a full life, had many children, had a full career. Who that person is, the history of that person, is different than the memory of that person. Here, the memory of that person is captured in a short piece of writing. It tries to capture the spirit of this person, but it can't quite capture the intricacies, the complications, all of the shades of a person's life. And we know this intuitively, but it's true as well when you take this example and you multiply it across an entire nation. One person died here. In the Civil War, many thousands of people died around a battle and around multiple battles. How do we remember that? Here, a quote that captures this succinctly. All wars are fought twice, first on the battlefield and second in our memory. There is a war that we have to relive when we're recalling a war, and we find the parts of it that we choose to remember. We disregard the parts we choose to forget. We do this so intuitively and naturally, we might not even be aware of it. So the memory of war is different than simply telling someone what happened. Why is all of this coming together in our lessons here? It's really critical for us to understand our world today in America, to think about these issues of memory. 75 million people in the United States are descended from Confederate soldiers. 80% of African Americans are descendants of enslaved Africans. The legacy of the Civil War and the institution of slavery that was the cause of the war is with us every day, with us in the people that we are. So it's not enough to say it happened and we're going to try to just capture what happened and move on. There is going to be a really distinct way that we in America choose to remember this for ourselves. In this way, the history is living every day, living in our legacies and our perceptions of who we are and who we aren't. So that brings us to the controversial question that you've considered, I know, in your other classes. Should we remove reminders of the Confederacy from public view? This is our topic for today. And if you've studied it, that's great. You'll be even more in the know about this. And maybe you can choose the text I'm offering as something to study. What does it mean for something to be a reminder of the Confederacy? Well, it's going to be somehow an image paying homage to what the Confederacy was, a Southern collection of states that seceded from the United States of America. When they did that, they formed their own national flag. They're depicted, the Confederate flag. Of course, Lincoln believed, and many believed after the war, it was illegal in the first place to secede. So there was no such thing as another nation. This is the problem with the Confederacy in its inception. Does it exist as a nation in someone's memory, or is it simply an attempt at civil war that failed? One of the images that comes up a lot in this nation building or nation questioning is one of Robert E. Lee or other famous generals. It's just that Robert E. Lee was perhaps the most famous Southern general. So here he is depicted on his horse, Traveler. And here he is in that same image in our local park, Market Street Park, which was, of course, the scene of much violence in August of 2017.
Charlottesville was quiet today. The white supremacists and counter-protesters have mostly gone home, and UVA students won't be arriving for fall semester until later this week. Things are still eerie here, but you do get a sense of solidarity from people walking around the mall downtown, even if they're still in shock. What happened here has had an obvious impact across the country, and officials in other southern states have begun making urgent calls to remove Confederate memorials before they become flashpoints of violence and unrest. In Durham, authorities are considering criminal vandalism charges against activists who took matters into their own hands on Monday and took down a Confederate memorial outside a courthouse. But stripping the South of its Confederate shrines isn't going to be simple or easy. Drive 30 miles north of Robert E. Lee Elementary School in Petersburg, Virginia, and you'll cross over the Robert E. Lee Memorial Bridge and into downtown Richmond, where at the center of Lee's Circle sits a bronze Robert E. Lee monument. It's one of 3 remaining statues dedicated solely to the Confederate general, including the one in Charlottesville that was at the center of this weekend's protests. Still, more than 100 historical markers carry his name. Confederate monuments are, unsurprisingly, concentrated in southern states, but the legacy of the Confederacy made its way as far west as the Robert E. Lee Elementary School in East Wenatchee, Washington, and the Robert E. Lee campgrounds in Boise, Idaho. As of last year, there were about 1,500 Confederate symbols still in public spaces. But why do all these monuments commemorating the side that lost the Civil War exist in the first place? Professor Kirk Savage explains that Confederate monuments first started popping up in the 1890s, and they were never just tributes to fallen heroes.
There was a really big systematic push to promote the history of the Confederacy and the so-called lost cause that was largely engineered by women's groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which had a very overt and systematic plan to rewrite textbooks, to erect public monuments that would establish the true history of the war.
Confederate symbols surged in the early 20th century, and in 1917, 52 years after the Civil War ended, the Charlottesville statue of Lee was commissioned. The statue reframes the narrative around the losing general by presenting him in a position of power atop his horse Traveler, who is said to buck any black servant who tried to ride him.
It's basically a metaphor of command. The person riding the animal is the commander of the horse and therefore by extension the commander of men. Blacks, who are almost never represented in the 19th century in sculpture, are put in a very different position, typically a subordinate position. It sort of reinscribes forever the relation of white domination.
And now, generations later, people have come to see these statues as symbols of Southern power and dominance. With their removal, they feel their history is under threat.
I understand how the removal of a statue now can be framed as they're stealing our history. And I think it's a smart move on their part, but it's a very false framing.
And that's why the decision to keep or remove these statues has become so controversial.
It's very hard because it requires taking a long, hard look at our national history and trying to come to grips with the truth of that. You start to pry apart a national mythology, and part of the problem is that, our national mythology has been built on this oppression of African Americans. So it opens up a Pandora's box, I think, particularly for the whites who have benefited from this history of oppression for so long. It's a very, very fundamental problem, and that's what you see just like erupting in Charlottesville.
Okay, so moving past that slide, because we'll keep going into this issue a little deeper and find another video as well. The question that I'll pose is, should this be removed? If you choose to write this for your précis, you'll have to engage with this question. Use him as our next text source. We've looked at Michael Shara's Killer Angels, we've looked at the writing itself of Robert E. Lee, and now we'll consider Bryan Stevenson, who he's the founder and director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and to try to exonerate those prisoners who are innocent. This is all depicted in the movie Just Mercy and his book, Just Mercy. So that might be where you've heard his name before recently. All right, so here's an interview he did with Katie Couric, and we're going to watch this as the last piece of today. Question framing this film is, why is it so hard to talk about America's past?
Such a hard time coming to terms with our past and some of the uglier chapters We think that saying I'm sorry makes you weak. And I think that's what has to change in this country. You can't actually tell the truth if you're not willing to confront the mistakes you've made. If you go to South Africa, you see a nation that is committed to never forgetting apartheid. There's an apartheid museum. If you go to Rwanda, you see a country that is determined to not forget the genocide. And if you go to the Genocide Museum, they actually have human skulls in there. That's just how powerfully they want to express their pain and anguish. I was in Berlin a month ago, and when you go to Berlin, you can't go 100 meters without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were abducted during the Holocaust. And the Germans want you to go to that Holocaust memorial because they want to change their identity. They haven't pretended that there wasn't this thing called the Holocaust. But in America, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation. And because of that, we don't have a healthy relationship with one another on the topic of race.
Why are memorials, statues, schools, highways, why is this symbolism so important? There are some people, I think, who think, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What's the big deal?
When we honor people that tried to defend and perpetuate slavery, we create that same kind of dissonance. We cannot legitimate slavery. We cannot legitimate lynching. We cannot honor segregation and racial hierarchy. We just can't do it and recover. And that's the reason why those statues matter, those street names matter.
Those statues and schools and highways send an incredibly powerful symbol that is really almost hard to describe.
It is hard to describe, and the history around them makes that symbol even more disruptive, even more painful. Because these monuments and memorials were largely erected to signal triumph of a narrative war. The North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They won the battle of never having to apologize for the violence and destruction, having enslaved people. It was designed to communicate to black people that racial hierarchy, white supremacy, will still be the law of the land. And I don't think we've appreciated the harm, the psychic harm of what these symbols can do. And not just to African Americans and people of color, to all of us. Because when we are forced in this region to make ourselves proud of things that are not worthy of pride, to make ourselves proud of things that should really induce shame, we corrupt ourselves. We really do.
Should statues of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and other Confederate heroes be removed in your view?
I want to remove them because we all get closer to recognizing that they should have never been put up in the first place. I want us to get to the point where we accept and acknowledge that we're celebrating things that we shouldn't be celebrating. We should actually name some streets after white Southerners who tried to end slavery. We could name streets and schools after white Southerners who tried to stop lynching. And then we could all be proud of that. And it would do something that these symbols don't do, which is that it could bring people together.
How do you convince people who feel these statues are so associated with their personal stories that they don't want to let that go?
My interest in talking about our history is to not punish America for this history. I want to liberate us. And there is a way to be a white Southerner and proud of who you are and acknowledge the pain of this past. That's what restoration is about. That's what reconciliation is about.
So here is a text that you can study. If you're interested in that interview, if you want to look at his language further and uncover what you believe he's saying, then I encourage you to choose it. The STEM for today is memory is different from history, and you are to, in the kernel sentence structure, take that and expand it.